that these FMPPs, if there's any nuclear accident, then it's going to affect everyone. In fact, virtually all of them in the recent times kept to themselves. They seldom speak up in class. They don't even try to engage in any private conversation either. And some were telling me that maybe because they actually report on each other, so therefore they found that better to just simply keep quiet. Otherwise, they'll be reported to authorities for having deviant thinking or even criticizing the government.
In this episode, China's plans to deploy floating nuclear plants in South China Sea. First, unveiling the impact on Asia's security and regional power relations. Second, another Fukushima-like disaster in the making. Next, influx of wealthy Chinese into Singapore and understanding the factors driving Chinese citizens to leave China after lockdowns. Finally, Shibani Matani's CCP information warfare investigation and CCP propaganda targeting older Chinese. Also, quiet and frightened Chinese students in Singaporean universities.
Hi everyone, I would like to welcome our guest today. It's Dr. Collin from Singapore. He's a senior fellow, coordinator of projects, naval and maritime affairs from the RSIS in Singapore. Collin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Richard, for having me on your show.
Thank you very much. Could you please say a few words about yourself? What do you usually do? What is your area of expertise?
I look at maritime security and naval affairs, and this is an area that I've been looking at since I started my PhD more than 10 years ago. I've been doing my PhD for a long time, actually. So along the way, I developed sub-interests that are related, and one of which being, of course, the South China Sea. And then you realize that when you get South China Sea, then Taiwan also comes into the picture, and at least the eastern part of the Indian Ocean comes into the picture as well. So when you look at maritime security, it sort of force you to expand. For me, it's not so much me being forced, but I think in a way it is so interesting to look at many interrelated issues. So over the past 10 years or so, this is what I'm looking at.
The first thing I wanted to ask you about was a report that was probably overlooked but by most experts about China's intentions to deploy floating nuclear plants in the South China Sea. Could you please talk a little bit about that? Because that's a really, really fascinating issue.
Indeed. It is fascinating in so much because there are some very important issues to consider. The first is that, of course, if you have realized, China has been going very heavy on criticizing Japan over the Fukushima release that is planned. And of course, the IAEA has given, the sort of green light for that. And of course, just about 2 years ago, there was a collision by the USS Connecticut, which is a nuclear submarine in the South China Sea. And China was also going very big on that. So if you look at, the floating nuclear power plant report, and you juxtapose it with its criticism of what others are doing, then it certainly presents a very sharp contrast between what China wants others not to do and what it plans to do. So when you look at the floating NPP report, which of course, I think some months ago, there was a report coming out that China has sort of reconsidered the plan for the FMPP in the South China Sea because of the potential fallout. And considering that China has a developing coastal economy, the South China Sea is certainly one area that they are so interested in. But that being said, the key reason why they want a floating NPP is largely also because, for a long time, they have been grappling with the sustainability issue for their garrisons out there in the far-flung outposts in the Spratly Islands, for example. So FMPP is supposed to sort of resolve the long-term power supply issue. And of course, if you go by the report that came out on the FMPP and the motives behind, there are some key issues that are really worth studying. One of which being, of course, the power that is generated will be more than sufficient to sort of activate and operate a good number of high-end weapon systems. Say, for example, pulse type weapon systems that require a lot of power, which I believe the conventional power generation systems that the Chinese have on those outposts may not be that sufficient to hold them. So that is one consideration. And obviously, in ASEAN, there hasn't been a lot of talk about it because it is so sensitive. Now, if this plan goes ahead, then I will suppose there will be some opposition amongst the ASEAN member states of the concern that these FMPPs, if there's any nuclear accident, then it's going to affect everyone. So on the other hand, I think if those in Beijing are cognizant of the potential double standards that they're projecting, then they will have to think twice before they push forth a floating nuclear power plant without considering that it will be the next Fukushima in the making, and then thereby making them look like a laughing stock in the international community when they have already criticized Japan. So I think this is an evolving issue that we are looking at. But as a Southeast Asian, I will say that I believe the member governments in ASEAN will really have to start looking seriously into it, and thereby also have to reach out to Beijing to dissuade China from proceeding with the plan.
Great, thank you. That's really very interesting. That's maybe another conflict we have coming. So it's good that you highlighted it. Thank you very much. The second thing I wanted to ask you is, since you're Singaporean, I have a very unique opportunity to ask you about something I've been looking into in the last year. After the lockdowns in China, there's been a huge influx of, I think, mostly rich Chinese into Singapore. So I wanted to ask you, how is it being perceived in Singapore? How are those people being welcomed? And also, what do they do? Like, it's been reported they buy a lot of prime real estate, they drive prices up. So yeah, there's few questions about who are they, what do they do, how are they being perceived in Singapore? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. This is a very interesting question that me being a Singaporean and bearing in mind that I myself am ethnic Chinese, so sometimes it does come across as sensitive to some people. But my own personal view is that, at least from what I know, is that, as you rightly pointed out, many of them who came here during the pandemic period, they are from rich background. And obviously, the pandemic lockdown in China and the economic problems that came thereafter in China would have prompted them to take their capital and sort of get out of the country and invest in some places that can generate better returns of investments for themselves. So this is the phenomenon that obviously for Singapore, being a country that has thrived on globalization, cannot very well ignore. And given that Singapore itself is also trying to get back on its feet after the pandemic, and to get economic development and growth all restarted thereafter, the influx of these wealthy Chinese elites would be welcomed in a way. Now, this is, of course, very much the case where the government looks at it from the economic pragmatism point of view. Down on the ground, I think there are mixed views on that. So on the one hand, there are those who will complain that, these rich Chinese people who come here, they were flooding the property and real estate market, and thereby they're driving up the prices. I think on that, there are certainly some measures that the government is undertaking in the more recent times. If I could bring you back to the earlier decade when, the ruling PAP actually started to find itself under challenge from groundswell discontent over housing prices, jobs, and all that. So over these 10 years or so, I think the ruling PAP is better prepared to deal with all that. So there are some measures that are likely implemented already that will help to mitigate the potential spillover effects of mainland Chinese people coming to invest in Singapore. So I think that is what. But I think the key problem here, which is what belongs to the second group of people will think about is in terms of the integration. I mean, this is a long-standing problem. In fact, it predates the pandemic itself. It has been a talking point over the many elections that we have had in the recent times. And this is, one key issue where, say Chinese immigrants who come into Singapore, they might not be necessarily so well integrated. Sometimes there were, of course, anecdotal evidences to show that, they tend to form enclaves amongst themselves. They tend to stick amongst themselves. They refuse to integrate, and they sometimes even try to impose their mainland habits into Singapore. So that is one. And of course, the greatest bugbear that I think across the various ethnicities in Singapore, because you know that Singapore is a multiracial society. We have ethnic Chinese, we have ethnic Malays, and we have ethnic Indians. So in Singapore, the working language is English. So the problem with a number of these Chinese immigrants is that either they can't speak very good English or even comprehensible English, or that simply they refuse to speak English at all. And sometimes it does create communication issue, and with communication issue, it brings misunderstanding. So I think these are the general concerns amongst the Singapore society, in the public at least. But from the political point of view, I think with respect not just to Chinese immigrant, I don't think that is so much an interrelated issue necessarily. But Singapore has always been highlighting that the country isn't a Chinese nation. I mean, if you look at what the leadership has been talking about in the recent times, there are concerns that we might potentially have been seen to be a Chinese nation that by default has to support the Chinese government and its agenda, including, say, the South China Sea. We had a sort of a big quarrel that was pretty unprecedented before that. It was in 2016 after the arbitral award on the South China Sea came out. And just because the Singapore government released a sort of statement to take note, and it's not even endorsing or not even supporting, the word is so clear-cut, it is to take note of the award. And it generated quite a controversy because, the Chinese government got so upset about it. And thereafter, a number of unhappy incidents came about. So I think these are impresses upon the Singapore leadership that we have to be very mindful to ensure that we maintain our identity as a sovereign, independent state. And we are essentially multiracial, multi-ethnic in nature. So I think these are, what I will see as a sort of multifaceted, very complex issue. And finally, to your question, it really depends also on who you're asking. If you're asking the younger Singaporeans, they tend to have, a much stronger sense of Singaporean self-identity. Well, if you ask the older generations, especially the ethnic Chinese older generation, they may have some, existing familial ties back to the mainland. And, therefore they may have some empathy for the mainland. And in some cases, they could be seen to be promoting or even supporting, mainland China's position on certain things. So I think it is a very complex, multi-layered issue in Singapore.
Dear viewers, help us overcome algorithm suppression by liking, commenting, and sharing this important content, especially since we talk to world's top experts.
Do those people actually say why? I think the wave started to coming after the lockdowns. So what is it that they are saying now about China? Because my impression is that the Chinese have been, until COVID, actually to a huge extent, very proud of their country and their achievements. So whatever the West is saying, it seems to me that a lot of Chinese were actually proud of their country. So it seems now that maybe they are losing either confidence or they are fed up with what the government can do to them. And they see, maybe the West has been right. It's kind of a dictatorial government that we have. What is it that those people are telling Singaporeans about the current China?
I don't think they have sort of reached out to Singaporeans and sort of tried to tell Singaporeans how they feel. For the most part, based at least on my own experience, is that many of them tend to be more reserved, and they tend to be more reserved. They keep to themselves. And so, in a way, there are some likely concerns that they have, which I can list out a few reasons. One of which being what you may have just mentioned, that, given the problems that China has faced in the more recent time since COVID, there has been some denting of a sense of self-confidence for the country. That might have been the case, of course. The second could be that because of the very recent issues that China had found itself in, in a way, they are not very pleasant issues to talk about. They are not exactly things that you can feel glorified about. So, it is better to just simply lay low and just, do what you need to do and simply just keep quiet about it. So I think this is the predominant reason, which I don't think it has to do with confidence issues or not, because if you speak to especially younger mainland Chinese people, I think there's still a general sense that today's China is strong and modern. It is a superpower in its own right. So it has to be respected as such. So I don't think that thinking has been lost even with the pandemic. And if anything, I think there are some who might even feel more indignated that, they could have risen even faster and grown even stronger if not because of the US. Right? So they started blaming, other factors for holding them back. And sometimes, they may not even be so interested in talking about their own domestic policies that led to some of those problems. So it's very complex. But for the most part in Singapore, I think a good number of them I think are quite low profile, and they simply are more interested in their own business dealings. And even, those Chinese students in the university community are not necessarily talking much either. At least I can speak from my own experience as a lecturer. My own experience with my students, a good number of them are from mainland China. They are quite quiet, to be honest. They are quiet, and I expected them, to be very vocal in class in somewhat, promoting their country's position or even defending their country's position. But I was proven quite wrong. In fact, virtually all of them in the recent times kept to themselves. They seldom speak up in class. They don't even try to engage in any private conversation either. And some were telling me that maybe because, they actually report on each other. So therefore, they found that, better to just simply keep quiet. Otherwise, to be reported to authorities for having deviant thinking or even criticizing the government, and then they will get repercussion thereafter. So it might be the case, but I think, the general sentiment I got is that, they aren't exactly very keen to talk about themselves and all that. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really very, very interesting. Fantastic. Thank you so much. The second related issue I wanted to ask about Shibani Mahtani's investigation into Cao Bao's pro-Beijing coverage and targeting older Chinese residents in Singapore. That's really very interesting, though. So could you tell us, why did the newspaper give in to a pro-China coverage? How did they become so very much pro-Beijing? And how does it work on the Singaporeans or not?
Well, okay, this is a very interesting question now. To the article that was published on this issue, 联合早报 thereafter very quickly came up with a rebuttal. And of course, one of the key reasons being that, in our editorial practice, we simply just allow all types of voices to come in to sort of make their views heard, which thereby not just because this person belongs to this particular institution, thereby we have to censor him or her away. On surface, if you ask me, that is a very valid editorial reason. But obviously, the other thing that came to my mind is that the other part of editorial practice is also to ensure that you scrutinize very carefully what was being written, right? So there are things that, you have to vet through very carefully before you allow that to happen, because otherwise, we go against the government policy of ensuring that there is no fake news or there is no disinformation. There must be some consistency in that sense. But that aside, now, from what I know is that 联合早报 is, based on what some people were telling me, is that besides the Chinese media, say China Daily, Xinhua, and all that, 联合早报 is probably the most read media outside China that is read by Chinese people in China itself. So this was also taken as a compliment in a way that 联合早报 could pride itself on being the gateway for Chinese people to look into the outside world through a lens that is not necessarily Western in nature. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that for 联合早报, its editorial practice, and of course some will argue its certain preferences or inclination, I think it can also be explained by commercial imperatives. Look, if you just simply have 联合早报 cater to just ethnic Chinese people in Singapore, and you know Singapore has a very small population, it's not going to get anywhere, right? So thereafter, it makes more sense from the commercial point of view to try to reach out to a much wider market, therefore. So in a way, this is something that you cannot dismiss, simply as, it is an excuse. I don't think it's so much an excuse, but I think from the commercial point of view, this is very likely what 联合早报 is more interested in, rather than, deliberately trying to position itself as an agent of Beijing's propaganda or pro-Beijing voices. So I think this is what I believe to be the case.
If you believe in me, please like it, leave a comment and share the show with friends. It might not look like it, but I have quite a lot of expenses. I am not asking for money, only for support. The goal of this program is to spread the knowledge.
That being said, on the other hand, we could also see, for example, in Southeast Asia, a number of Chinese dailies that were targeted at the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia appear to also have a certain slant. Those in Malaysia as well, and some in Indonesia as well, where they appear to have a certain slant towards Beijing. And the reception in Singapore is that 联合早报 tends to be read by the older generation. I could at least anecdotally share that my dad is reading 联合早报 every day, using his tablet. It used to be in print, now it's in tablet. Print business is going nowhere. So in today's world, most people, if you have an electronic device, can read it digitally. So it has widened its access, but at the same time, it's also clear that 联合早报 caters to a certain audience. That audience is still substantial because the older generation who couldn't read English and they could read Chinese only, were the older generations, and they are still sizable in the makeup of the population. So I think there could be those who were, gradually so sensitized to Beijing's, so-called propaganda, if you want to call that, and they started to believe that, Beijing is the victim of U.S. containment. U.S. is a bully. U.S. is a hegemon going around pushing people, and China is victimized by that. They may thereby lend to themselves to this sort of perception, and they stand on their side. But of course, there are those who may not, largely because they could have read more widely, for example. So I think this is a very complex issue, and I think again goes back to my earlier point that it really depends on who you are asking. If you are asking, the older ethnic Chinese people, then you are likely going to get a more positive perceptions and feedback on 联合早报, whereas you will have the younger ones who probably tend to be more neutral, or simply because they will tell you that, oh no, we don't read 联合早报, we read Straits Times, we read Channel News Asia, but not 联合早报. Yeah.